The history of the motor car is marked by seismic events. Ones that shaped its golden age and pushed it forward, creating some of the most incredible machines ever made. But there is one moment in history that has flown under the radar: the genesis of the executive saloon. Two cars that did battle in the booming landscape of the 1960s to forge the path for the car of today. A pair of cars that led a revolution in design and technology, defining an entire category in their wake. But in the end, this revolution and the events afterwards, the management, the turmoil, led to a collapse that ultimately paved the way for the marques of today, like Mercedes and BMW. In 1963, a revolution would take place, the BC and AD of the modern day saloon, the launch of the Rover P5 and the Triumph 2000. Two cars that would do battle in some of the most treacherous conditions of the time. The question is, who won? This is the story of the two executive cars locked in a fight for supremacy. This is Rover vs Triumph, the executive car showdown. Hello everybody and welcome to this video on the ultimate showdown. If you're not subscribed already, please make sure to do so. It really does help me out and you get to see more of this. More cars and classics uncovered, more projects and more history videos. This video is on the Triumph 2000 and the Rover P5 and how they duelled to the death in the early 60s. Do you have any Rover or Triumph memories or any opinions on the P5 versus the Triumph 2000? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to like the video if you liked it and share if you want other people to see it. But without further delay, let's get into this video on two of the most incredible cars ever made. The world of 1950s luxury cars is one of incredible complexity. In the UK and Europe you had the Big Five, the Rover P5, the Vauxhall Cresta, Ford Zodiac, the Humber Super Snipe and the Austin Westminster. Cars on the continent were also making a difference. The Mercedes W180 was selling well. The French had just led a complete technological revolution with the DS, but this was an acquired taste. It didn't quite have the universal appeal needed to truly take the market by storm at the time. As the rebuilding after World War II gathered pace, economies recovered, new social classes were born and defined. There emerged a new consumer base that didn't quite have the cash for the boardroom bruisers like the P5 and Zodiac, but still wanted the luxury. This newly defined social class had another requirement. The cars they drove needed to be dynamic. Cars like the Rover P4 and the Jowett Javelin weren't dynamic, they were traditional, with the P4 at the time gaining the derogatory term being called the anti-Rover. Other options at the time, the Jaguar Mark I and Mark II, were racy but pricey, at around £1,764 new. BMW were still offering their old range and weren't a sure bet thanks to their financial difficulties. Mercedes didn't really have anything to fit the bill either, so this left a wide open gap in the market. Meanwhile, at two of Britain's premier manufacturers, two cars were taking shape. In 1953, Rover would begin development on their P6, the successor to the P4. Rover had its finger on the pulse thanks to its internal talent. It was also in its golden age. Standard Triumph though was a different story in some regards. Standard had started development on their car in 1957, but the Standard name was one in decline. Its vanguards had been clobbered by the Rovers, Fords and Vauxhalls of the decade. It needed some dynamism to succeed. Luckily for Standard, its acquisition of the Triumph name from the ashes of its pre-war self was a goldmine. Cars like the Dolomite Roadster evoked a pre-war charm, but not in the stodgy way you may think. The Triumphs of the interwar years were glamorous, ornate, racy things that were aspirational. The Triumph of the day was more of the same. Its TR2 a few years earlier had brought 100 miles per hour to the masses. Triumph was setting speed records, thrashing around famous circuits all over Europe. The appeal was there, and it was decided the new saloon and all future cars would wear the Triumph name. Rover were underway as well. Their name also had cachet. They were known for their dependable interwar years, and the luxury of the P5, and of course the revolutionary jet cars. The Rover was to be a high technology showcase, drawing inspiration from the technological masterwork that was the Citroën DS. The Triumph, a sporty saloon drawing inspiration from its sports cars, a more traditional affair, but a step forward. Both were made for the emerging executive, the young, affluent, middle-class motorist of tomorrow. Development gathered pace on both. Project Zebu, the Triumph, wasn't going well. It would need a rethink. At the time it had a separate chassis. The styling was very focused on the past, rather than the present. The P6 at the time looked just as awkward. Both cars would start to gain more definition by the end of the 1950s. The Triumph would get a complete rethink with Project Barb. The Rover would get a more universal look, widening its appeal thanks to David Bache. At the time though, a storm was brewing, something that would nearly eradicate the entire British car industry. During the development of Barb, at a crucial time when money was tight, the new plant in Speke, Liverpool would go on strike, squeezing cash flow for standard Triumph and causing development to stall. Rover were completely unimpeded. The P6 was going well. It had been engineered not just for the present Rovers, but its ambitious gas turbine future. Triumph's woes would pause for now, but the first tremors of a major quake had been felt. Both cars would start to diverge. The suspension and chassis development would truly set these cars apart. The suspension on the new Rover was unconventional. Its Didion tube at the rear and bell crank system at the front had several advantages. Thanks to its mounting points for the front suspension, it gave the P6 a wider engine bay for the gas turbine unit. It also had better front crumple zones as well, giving more space before the suspension and steering components interfered with the cabin in the event of a crash. The rear suspension, thanks to its Didion tube, meant both wheels would always be perpendicular to each other, giving the car better road holding and traction. The suspension on the Triumph would be more conventional by comparison, with its semi-trailing arm rear suspension and vertical struts at the front, two opposing configurations, both with their own reasoning. By this time both were racing towards launch. The P6 had gained its power unit, the 2-litre inline-4 overhead valve unit. The Triumph had its 2-litre inline-6, again both completely opposed. The P6 more continental, the Triumph the opposite, but both fitting into that magic 2-litre category that many marques had lacked at the time. And by 1963 both were ready. The Triumph had shaken off its strikes that caused its development to be delayed. The Rover, a technological tour de force, had finally settled. On October the 9th that year, at the Earl's Court Motor Show, the Rover 2000 would be unveiled, the first of a new breed, a new age of saloon. Next to burst on the scene a week later would be the Triumph 2000. It would be launched at the London Motor Show on the 15th of October 1963. The motoring public had just witnessed something of a Big Bang moment. The next generation of saloon. The seismic event that would set the template for the saloon car for the next 50 years had just taken place. But in the midst of all these celebrations, the Rover P6 and Triumph saloons were now at war. Both marched into battle merely a week apart, but this is where it gets complicated. Both cars were received incredibly well by the press, so much so it really did come down to one thing: personal taste. The Rover was a complete departure from what came before it. It did exactly what it promised. It was technologically advanced for the motorist of the day and the day after. The Triumph did what it promised as well, offering a dynamic, sporting and smooth car, a sports car that could carry the kids, and some shopping in comfort. Gone were the days of ditching your younger dreams of a sports car. You really could have both with these saloons. In early 1964 both cars were made available to the public, but the very elements that caused Triumph to lose time in its development were now bearing down on the P6. By mid-1964 Solihull was at a standstill. 4,100 people would walk out over a membership dispute for one person. Meanwhile, 2000s of the Triumph kind flew off the line. It was almost like the Rover workers wanted the Triumph to win. And in 1964 Rover would only manage 7,235 P6s, but Triumph would almost double that, with 18,490. Rover's then chairman George Farmer would then weigh in, giving an interview with the Observer newspaper. He said the real problem wasn't selling the cars, it was making them, and he was right. It seemed to be a done deal. The Triumph was triumphant. One of the biggest criticisms the Rover had at the time was its lack of a large engine offering. The inline 6 was silky smooth, a characteristic that the Rover couldn't match with its inline 4, and the strikes were ruining any chance Rover had of developing something that could match. The P6 would finally get some respite. The strikes were easing off. It was time for it to flood the market. At the time, these saloons were so dominant, they represented nearly 90% of the new car market for executive saloons in the UK. A massive milestone, and with the 30% tariff on imported cars, it seemed they would be unopposed for years to come. Both were selling well. Other manufacturers were watching from afar as the battle of the 2000s raged on. The P6 would gain some ground thanks to the bite of the Suez Crisis, but so would the Triumph. It seemed the entire market was converging on these two cars. But what about the other competitors? Humber couldn't keep up. The sun was setting on the Roots Group empire. Opposition from BMC was woeful in comparison, but there was something on the horizon that would end the battle in an awkward truce. In 1967, Rover would be purchased by Triumph's parent company Leyland. The two names that had battled in the market now had to put those differences aside and battle in the accounts department and the boardroom. The rules of engagement had changed, but Rover would fire one last salvo. Rover, lacking larger engines, had years earlier purchased the rights to an unwanted Buick V8. This appeared first in the P5B in 1967, and it was a complete revelation. This all-aluminium V8 was perfect for its higher-end models. Attention would turn to the P6 and its cavernous engine bay. This would be the perfect place to mount a final assault on the Triumph. And the next year, in the year of British Leyland's formation in 1968, the Rover P6 3500 would be launched. With the power of the 3.5 litre V8 and the complexity of the P6, it was a winning combination. Finally, a worthy competitor to the 2000s inline 6. Triumph would respond with their 2500 Pi, a petrol injection version of their inline 6, with its capacity enlarged to 2.5 litres. The issue was, in order for these cars to have their final rematch, they actually needed to leave the factory. 1968 was completely manic for the British car industry. The complete amalgamation of marques into British Leyland brought shake-ups and mess-ups all round. A lack of communication, one worker said, made the atmosphere at times intolerable. Rumours of redundancy would follow. Workers already unhappy with the state of affairs and empowered by the unions would flip the company on its head. Both cars would need to be facelifted for the 1970s. The new Triumph saloons would launch in 1969, but two screws on the dashboard would stop it from being available to the public. Thanks to a massive dispute, workers would lose jobs, union bosses would meet about two screws on a dashboard, and the rot would set in. Meanwhile, across the channel, BMW's new class models were taking hold. It had staved off its near financial collapse in the 1950s and had emerged much stronger. The Mercedes W115 was also eagerly watching. As Britain's car industry faltered, the cars that followed the same template as the two cars that created this revolution were ready to strike. And to top it all off, at the time, Britain was looking to join the European Economic Community to allow more free trade. The issue was, while European car companies were getting ready, the British ones were falling apart. The very foundations laid by Rover and Triumph were going to be paved over if they weren't careful. Rover at the time were experimenting with technology on the P7, very reminiscent of the modern day Mercedes Magic Body Control, but of course far more analogue. Triumph were creating another driver-focused follow-up to their successful saloons, very reminiscent of BMW's ultimate driving machines. And as the very firms who defined the modern motor car faltered, the gates were opened in January 1973. The perfectly positioned cars from the Europeans would take over, ending the duel between the Rover and Triumph with one key difference: the ability to get the cars out of the factory with minimal fuss. They wouldn't achieve hegemony until the mid-80s, but looking at their strategy, it's very clear. BMW is Triumph, Mercedes is Rover. The battle for supremacy had been won between Rover and Triumph. The two British brands had duelled to the death, battered and bruised, bludgeoned and bloodied, but one victor emerged, 700 miles away in Germany. And that is the end of the video. What is your opinion on the battle of the 2000s, and who won? Let me know in the comments below. But as always, thank you for watching, keep watching and remember to subscribe for more of this, and I'll see you in the next one.